economic limit is simply the fact that the very prices that we need to extract high-cost sources of fossil fuels, like, for example, Canada's tar sands, which is the most expensive oil in the world to produce. The problem is that the very triple-digit oil prices that make resources like the tar sands, shale formations, Arctic oil, deep water oil commercially viable translate into the same very prices that kill economic growth and hence the demand for fossil fuels. Let's take, for example, the Canadian tar sands, which today are supposed to be the third largest oil reserve in the world behind the Venezuela tar sands and Saudi Arabia's deposits of conventional oil. The tar sands are not a new discovery. As early as 1920, there was a pilot plant that tried to extract bitumen from the tar sands. But they were, for decades and decades, a neglected resource. And it wasn't because people didn't realize how much oil was buried under the Alberta muskeg. People knew that there were billions of barrels of oil. There's something like 170 billion barrels. The reason it was neglected for commercial development was because the cost of extracting that oil from the oil sands didn't make any commercial sense. In other words, the cost of extracting the oil was greater than the price of oil. So who was going to bother sinking capital to develop that? And so for decades and decades and decades, the oil sands or tar sands weren't even considered an oil reserve, because an oil reserve isn't just about geology, it's about economics. It's about whether this reserve can be commercially extracted. Until, of course, about the 1990s, 2000. And what happened then? Well, what happened then is oil prices started to rise. And oil prices started to rise not because of anything that was happening in the Middle East, not because of any kind of curtailment of supply. Oil prices were rising because the cheap oil that had powered the world economy, the oil from Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, the conventional oil, it wasn't growing anymore. And contrary to what you may hear in the media about how OPEC has opened up the spigots to marginalize North American oil production, conventional oil production, OPEC, peaked in about 2005. And that meant that as the world economy continued to grow and needed more and more oil, that we had to find oil from new places. And the new places that we were looking for oil wasn't in OPEC, it was in unconventional oil. It was oil buried under the sea. It was oil in shale formations. And it was oil trapped in the oil sands. And all of a sudden, the oil sands went from this marginal, neglected resource that people knew about but didn't think was commercially viable to all of a sudden one of the hottest oil plays in the world, where it wasn't just Canadian capital, it was capital from all around the world was invested in the Alberta oil sands. And as oil prices started to rise from $30 to $50 to $70 to $100 and all the way up to $147 a barrel before the last recession, all of a sudden this marginal resource became the darling of the world oil industry. One of the reasons it became the darling of the world oil industry is that unlike most places in the world, North America is one of the few places where private firms can develop oil. Private firms like Suncor or Exxon, they can't go into Saudi Arabia. The oil production of Saudi Arabia is Saudi Aramco, a national oil company. But it's not just the Middle East. Even Mexico, oil was nationalized, and Pemex was the national oil company. So a firm like Exxon or Shell couldn't invest. In Venezuela, which has a bigger oil sands than Canada, Exxon plowed billions of dollars in until Hugo Chavez all of a sudden nationalized them. And probably, although most people in Alberta wouldn't recognize this, Hugo Chavez did more to help the Alberta oil industry than probably any single individual. Because by driving Exxon and Shell and Total out of Venezuela, which has a similar resource to the oil sands, guess where they ended up going? They came here. And shortly after the expropriation of Exxon in Venezuela, Exxon gave the green light to its Canadian subsidiary, Imperial Oil, to develop the giant Kearl Lake mine, which is the biggest project that Exxon has going on anywhere in the world. So the combination of we were open to private investment and triple-digit oil prices all of a sudden made this marginal resource into the third largest oil reserve in the world. And production started growing exponentially from 300,000 barrels to all of a sudden 1 million barrels. And then production doubled to 2 million barrels a day. And all of a sudden Canada, which was always a sort of mid-tier oil producer of conventional oil in the Western Sedimentary Basin in Alberta, started to have like OPEC-like numbers. All of a sudden Canada was in like the top 5, 6 oil producer in the world. But the problem was that the very triple-digit oil prices that turned this marginal resource into the third largest oil reserve in the world and catapulted Canada into the front ranks of oil production killed economic growth. I mean, we have now 7 years of experience with these prices, and the problem is that the world economy does not run well with triple-digit oil prices. I mean, it does wonders for Fort McMurray in Alberta, or for the Bakkens in North Dakota, or for deep water oil. It makes all of these places commercially attractive, but it kills economic growth. And if you doubt that, just look at what's happened in the last 7, 8 years. The 2008 recession that followed on the heels of $147 a barrel oil is the deepest recession we've had in the post-war period. And moreover, the economic recovery since then has been the weakest on record. So that's the fundamental problem, is that the very triple-digit oil prices that bring the supply out of the ground kill the demand side and kill economic growth. And since oil is the most important fuel driving global GDP, when you have weak global GDP or worse, a recession, obviously it hammers oil prices.